Welcome, my friends, to StoryVerse English. I am so glad you are here with me today. Pull your chair a little closer, take a slow, deep breath, and get ready, because today we are not just listening to a story. Today we are stepping into one of the greatest, most dramatic, most extraordinary journeys in all of human history. We are going to walk through fire and war, through betrayal and courage, through revolution and empire. We are going to see kings lose their heads and ordinary people change the world. We are going to travel through centuries of blood and brilliance and beauty. This is the story of England, not the beginning. You already know that road. This is what came after. This is the part where things got complicated, where things got dangerous, where things got truly, magnificently, unforgettably interesting. Stay with me. This one will take you somewhere. After the Normans came, England was never a quiet place again. William the Conqueror had won his battle. He had taken the throne. He had changed the language and the laws and the faces of power. But winning a kingdom and keeping a kingdom are two very different things, and the story of England in the centuries after 1066 is really the story of that difference, the story of powerful people fighting to hold what they had, and ordinary people slowly, painfully, bravely fighting to have a say in their own lives. William ruled with an iron hand. He divided England into pieces and gave those pieces to his Norman lords. These lords built castles, cold and hard and permanent, that still stand today like stone memories of a time when power was absolute and question was dangerous. The ordinary people of England, the farmers and the craftsmen and the village dwellers, lived under these lords with very little freedom. They worked the land, they paid taxes, they obeyed. Their opinions did not matter. Their lives were not their own. But something was growing underneath all of that obedience, something quiet and persistent and impossible to fully crush, the idea that power had limits, that even a king could not do absolutely anything he wanted, that there were rules that applied to everyone, even the most powerful. This idea had no single author. It grew from many sources, from the old Anglo-Saxon traditions of councils and consultation, from the Church's insistence that God's law stood above any king's command, from the simple human instinct that injustice, when it goes on long enough, produces resistance. The man who first had to face this idea in its most dramatic form was King John. John was not a popular king. He was clever but suspicious, capable but cruel. He taxed his nobles heavily. He ignored their advice. He made decisions that hurt powerful people without giving them any way to push back. And in 1215, those powerful people had had enough. The barons of England, the great landowners who had for so long accepted royal authority, came together and did something that had never been done before. They confronted their king, not with an army, at least not yet, with words, with demands, with a document. They called it the Magna Carta, the Great Charter. It was a list of rights and limits. It said that even the king could not simply imprison a free man without proper legal process. It said that taxation required consent. It said that the law applied to everyone. John signed it at a place called Runnymede, beside the River Thames, in June of 1215. He signed it because he had no choice. He almost certainly intended to ignore it the moment he could, and he tried, but the document survives. It survived because the idea inside it was too powerful, too necessary, too right to disappear. The Magna Carta did not create democracy overnight. It did not free the common people or end the suffering of the poor. But it planted a seed that would grow for centuries, a seed that said this: no one is above the law, not a lord, not a baron, not a king. This single idea, fragile as it seemed in 1215, would eventually reshape the entire world. Decades passed. England continued its complicated, violent, fascinating story. Kings fought with their nobles. The church fought with the crown. England fought with France in a conflict so long it lasted over 100 years and earned the simple, exhausted name, the 100 Years' War. It was a war of muddy fields and bright armor, of longbows and siege engines, of moments of extraordinary heroism and years of grinding misery. England won great victories, including the famous Battle of Agincourt in 1415, where King Henry V led a small, exhausted English army to a stunning defeat of a much larger French force. The archers of England that day wrote their names into history with arrows, but the war also produced something unexpected. It produced a girl. A young French girl from a village in Lorraine who heard voices, who believed God had spoken to her, who picked up a sword and changed the direction of a war. Her name was Joan of Arc. She was not English. She was the enemy. But her story belongs to this chapter because her courage, her refusal, and her terrible death remind us that history is never just the story of kings and armies. It is also the story of individuals who decide, against all reason and all safety, to stand up for what they believe. Joan rallied the French. She turned the tide. And ultimately, England lost the 100 Years' War, lost almost everything it had gained in France. The soldiers came home, and home was not peaceful, because while England had been fighting abroad, something had been festering inside. Rivalries between great noble families, disputes over who had the right to sit on the English throne. And these disputes were about to explode into a conflict so bitter and so prolonged that it would be remembered by the color of two flowers: the red rose of Lancaster, the white rose of York. The Wars of the Roses had begun. The Wars of the Roses tore England apart from the inside. It was not a war between England and a foreign enemy. It was a war between English people, between cousins and uncles and brothers who shared blood and hated each other for it. The Lancasters and the Yorks both believed they had the rightful claim to the English throne, and they were willing to bleed the country dry to prove it. For 30 years, from 1455 to 1485, the crown of England changed hands again and again. Kings rose and fell. Men who were powerful one year were executed the next. Loyalty was a dangerous thing to have because the person you were loyal to might be dead or imprisoned before the season changed. England was exhausted. England was frightened. England needed something it had not had in a very long time: stability, certainty. A strong hand that would hold the country together instead of tearing it apart. That hand belonged to a man named Henry Tudor. He was not the most obvious candidate for king. He had spent years in exile in France, waiting, watching, surviving. His claim to the throne was real but complicated. But in 1485 he crossed the sea with a small army and met the reigning King Richard III at a place called Bosworth Field. The battle was fierce, and at the end of it, Richard III was dead in the mud and Henry Tudor was king. He became Henry VII, and with him the Tudor dynasty began, the Tudors. Even the name carries weight. It carries drama. Because the Tudor period in English history is one of the most extraordinary chapters any country has ever lived through. Change so fast and so deep that the England at the end of it was barely recognizable compared to the England at the beginning. Henry VII was careful and calculating. He rebuilt the royal finances. He kept the peace. He was not glamorous, but he was effective. The country began to breathe again, and when he died and his son took the throne, England was ready for something new. That son was Henry VIII, and Henry VIII was not careful. He was not calculating. He was enormous in every sense of the word. Physically large, intellectually brilliant, emotionally volatile, politically ruthless. He was a man of huge appetites and no patience for anyone who stood between him and what he wanted. What he wanted, more than anything, was a son, an heir, a male child who would inherit his throne and continue the Tudor line. His wife, Catherine of Aragon, had given him a daughter, the future Mary I, but no surviving son. Henry wanted to end his marriage and marry again. The Catholic Church said no. Divorce was not permitted. The Pope would not grant an annulment. And Henry VIII, who was not a man accustomed to being told no, made a decision that shook the foundations of Europe. He broke with Rome. He declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England. He dissolved the monasteries, those ancient centers of Catholic religious life, and took their wealth for the crown. He remade the religious landscape of England almost overnight. It was an act of breathtaking audacity. It was also an act with consequences so vast and so lasting that they are still felt today in the Church of England, in the relationship between Britain and the Catholic world, in the very idea of a country having its own national church. Henry married 6 times. 2 of his wives were executed. The country watched, fascinated and terrified, as the king pursued his desires and anyone who got in the way paid with their life. His closest advisor, Thomas More, who refused to acknowledge the king's supremacy over the church, was beheaded. The message was clear. In Henry's England, loyalty to the king came before East. Everything else, even conscience, even God. After Henry came his children. Edward VI, young and Protestant, who died before he could truly shape England. Then Mary I, who was Catholic and determined to bring England back to Rome, and whose burning of Protestant martyrs earned her the name Bloody Mary. England swung between faiths, between violence and counterviolence, between hope and terror. And then, in 1558, a woman took the throne who would give her name to one of the most remarkable eras in English history, Elizabeth I, the daughter of Henry VIII and his second wife Anne Boleyn, who had herself been executed on her husband's orders. Elizabeth had grown up in danger. She had learned to be careful, to be clever, to reveal nothing and trust no one completely. She had survived a childhood that would have broken most people. And when she finally became queen, she brought all of that hard-won wisdom to the job. Elizabeth ruled for 45 years. Under her reign, England became something it had never quite been before, a confident nation, a nation of explorers and poets and sailors and adventurers. Sir Francis Drake sailed around the world. William Shakespeare wrote his plays in the theaters of London, words so perfect and so true that they are still performed everywhere on earth today. English ships began to reach the far corners of the world, planting the first seeds of what would eventually become an empire. And when the greatest empire of the time, Spain, sent its massive fleet, the famous Armada, to invade England in 1588, Elizabeth stood before her troops at Tilbury and gave a speech that still makes the blood move faster. She told them that she had the body of a weak and feeble woman, but the heart and stomach of a king. The Armada was destroyed, partly by English courage and partly by the storms that scattered the Spanish ships. England survived. Elizabeth triumphed, and the story moved forward. Elizabeth died in 1603 without an heir. The Tudor dynasty ended with her, and the throne passed to the Stuart kings of Scotland. Beginning with James I, England and Scotland were now under one king, though they remained separate countries. It was a union of crowns, not yet a union of nations, and it was also the beginning of a new and dangerous argument. The argument about who truly held power in England, the king or the people. James I believed in the divine right of kings. He believed that God had placed him on the throne, and that to question royal authority was to question God himself. His son Charles I believed the same, and it was this belief, held with absolute certainty against the equally absolute certainty of an English parliament that believed it had rights and powers that no king could simply ignore, that led England to the most dramatic and terrible moment in its long story. Civil war, not a war against a foreign enemy, not a war between rival noble families as in the Wars of the Roses, but a war between a king and his own people, between the royalists who fought for Charles under the banner of loyalty and tradition, and the parliamentarians, who fought for the right of elected representatives to share in the government of the nation. It was a war that divided families. Brothers fought brothers. Fathers and sons stood on opposite sides of battlefields. The country bled. The parliamentary forces were eventually led by a man named Oliver Cromwell. He was not a king. He was not a noble. He was a country gentleman, a farmer, and a soldier, who turned out to have a genius for military command and an iron conviction that God was on his side. His cavalry, the Ironsides, became the most disciplined and effective fighting force in England, and under his leadership, the parliamentary army defeated the royalists. Charles I was captured. What happened next shocked all of Europe. Charles I was put on trial, a king tried in a court by his own subjects. He refused to recognize the court's authority. He argued, with considerable dignity, that no earthly court had the right to judge a king. The court disagreed. He was found guilty of treason, and on a cold January morning in 1649, outside the banqueting house in London, Charles I was executed, a king of England, beheaded by the people he had ruled. England became a republic. It was called the Commonwealth. Cromwell eventually became Lord Protector, which was in practice very much like being a king without the title. He was a complicated ruler. He brought order and military power, but also religious strictness that many people found suffocating. The theaters were closed. Celebrations were restricted. England under Cromwell was efficient and rather grim. When Cromwell died in 1658, the Republic died with him. His son could not hold power, and England, tired of experiencing, tired of strictness, tired of uncertainty, looked across the sea to where the dead king's son was waiting in exile. In 1660, Charles II returned to England. The monarchy was restored. The theaters reopened. The celebrations went on for days. London, which had suffered not only civil war but the Great Plague of 1665 and the Great Fire of 1666, felt like a city that had survived everything and was ready to live again. But the argument was not finished. It was never really finished. It had simply moved to a new phase. The question of the balance of power between crown and parliament continued to simmer through the reign of Charles II, and then exploded again under his Catholic brother James II. In 1688, in an event so careful and so bloodless compared to everything that had come before, that it was called the Glorious Revolution, Parliament invited a Dutch Protestant prince named William of Orange to take the English throne. James II fled. William and his wife Mary became joint monarchs. And crucially, they accepted a Bill of Rights that formally and permanently limited royal power and guaranteed certain rights to Parliament and to the English people. It was the Magna Carta's idea, grown up at last. No longer just a list of demands wrung from a reluctant king in a meadow. Now it was settled law. The foundation of a constitutional monarchy that would become the model for governments across the world. The idea that power must be limited, that rights must be protected, that the law stands above any single person, no matter how powerful. These ideas, born in England through centuries of struggle and war and argument and blood, would travel with English settlers and English books and English language to every corner of the earth. They would find their way into the American Declaration of Independence, into the French Revolution, into the constitutions of dozens of nations that had never been part of any English empire. England in the centuries after 1688 continued to grow and change. The Act of Union in 1707 joined England and Scotland into the Kingdom of Great Britain. The Industrial Revolution, which began in England in the mid-18th century, transformed not just the country but the entire world, replacing muscle with machine, village with city, candlelight with steam, and eventually electricity. The British Empire expanded until the maps of school children around the world were colored pink to show how much of the earth was under British rule. It was an empire that brought, depending on who you ask and where you stand, both extraordinary things and terrible ones, roads and railways and legal systems alongside conquest and cruelty, and the deep wounds of colonialism that have not yet fully healed. But through all of it, through empire and revolution and industrial transformation, and 2 world wars that shook the earth to its foundations, through the slow and painful and still unfinished work of becoming a fairer and more equal society, England kept moving, kept changing, kept arguing with itself about who it was and what it stood for. And that argument, that restless, stubborn, creative, sometimes maddening refusal to simply accept things as they are, might be the most English thing of all. The road that began in ancient forests and stone circles, that was walked by Roman soldiers and Saxon farmers and Viking raiders and Norman knights and Tudor monarchs and parliamentary soldiers and industrial workers, and the millions of ordinary people whose names history did not record, but whose lives and choices and courage made everything possible. That road is still being walked today, by people who carry in their language and their laws and their deepest instincts the long, complicated, magnificent inheritance of this island's story. You have been walking it with me today, and I hope it felt like something. I hope somewhere in these words you found a moment that surprised you, a moment that moved you, a moment that made the past feel less like a distant country and more like a place you have actually been. This has been StoryVerse English. If this story gave you something today, a new word, a new idea, a reason to keep learning, then please take one small moment right now. Hit that like button. It tells the world that stories like this one matter. Subscribe to StoryVerse English so that every new journey finds you the moment it begins, and leave a comment below. Tell me which moment in England's story surprised you the most. Tell me where in the world you are listening from. Tell me what story you want to hear next, because this channel exists for you, the learner, the listener, the one who showed up today and chose to grow. Every word you understood today was a step forward on your own road. Keep walking, my friends. The best stories are still ahead.